Billionaire's Contract episode. 6 Melissa's POV. It was past 8:30 already, and they even had their dinner in their respective rooms. Melissa was now sitting at the window, trying to read a book to distract herself. She was nervous without a doubt, because she has never had time for relationships or love. All her life until now, she has only concentrated on her kids, and so she got no time for herself. Sarah was always irritated and fed up making her understand to take out some time for herself, but she never listened. Melissa chuckled, remembering Sarah's angry face, and looked out of window. She had no idea how the kids were, and even if she wanted to know, she controlled herself because once she talks to, she won't be able to stop herself from going back. She could not even inform them about her departure and had asked Sarah to make up some story about her absence. It was just too difficult for her. "Are you done dreaming with your eyes open?" She was startled hearing his voice and found him standing at the door. He came inside and shut the door, making her shift nervously, looking here and there. Why was he so eager that he wanted to do it today? Couldn't he wait? And why was it necessary to have sex? He didn't mention something like that in the contract. Wait, he didn't mention having sex. Avant, before we baby. She stood up then and confidently stared at him. He just raised his eyebrow in return at her behavior. "I'm not having sex with you," she declared and waited for him to burst, but when he didn't, she looked at him. He was waiting for her to speak further. "What more? You have nowhere mentioned in the contract that the baby will be conceived by having sex, so if I don't want to do it that way, you cannot force me," she stated proudly, mentally patting her back for coming up with this solution. "You do realize that you have signed a contract with me, right?" he asked calmly. "Yes, I do. And if you want to sue me, you can, but it won't be called breach of contract, because there are other options to conceive a baby like IVF. But even after trying all the other options, if I don't get pregnant, and then you ask for having sex and I refuse, then that will be considered breach of your contract, Mr. Willingstone," she explained, and he was already looking at her with his jaw clenched and a dangerous glint in his eyes. He was annoyed because this was the second time she had found a loophole in his contract, and he hated every bit of it. What is the problem in having sex? It is the natural way to conceive. And if you are so scared to have sex, then you shouldn't have signed the contract. He snapped, and she narrowed her eyes. This man infuriated her to no end. "Well, if you are so desperate to have sex, then you can do it with someone else. I am absolutely not interested," she said arrogantly, and he stepped ahead, making her nervous. He pinned her to the wall without touching her, and she just pressed herself more into the wall. Raising his hand, he traced her cheek with his forefinger, and she closed her eyes tight. "You're fucking playing with fire, so don't complain later when you get burnt," he whispered dangerously, and she opened her eyes to stare into his. She never understood why his eyes were so blank, so cold and so guarded. He never let anyone even peer into him. Not even his friend. Why was he so mysterious? "I don't mind being burnt, Mr. Willingston, but I do mind losing my self-respect," she muttered sternly yet softly, and he stared at her for a few seconds before moving back and leaving the room. She sighed in relief and closed her eyes. He had this power to drain her mentally. Next morning came quickly, much to her disappointment, and she found herself roaming in the mansion again. Nelson was nowhere to be found, and she assumed he left for work. She was busy exploring when a maid came to her and handed her something. "Sir has ordered me to give this to you," she said. And before Melissa could ask anything, she left. Melissa looked at the box with confusion and opened it only to gasp in shock. It was a phone, very expensive, if she might add. But why the hell was he giving her this? As if he heard her question. The phone rang the next second, making her jump. She answered it and pressed it on her ear. "So, you got the phone? Now get ready fast and wait in the living room until my driver comes to pick you up." The line went dead after that, and she glared at the phone. Nevertheless, she got ready and waited in the living room as instructed. And a few minutes later, she was in the car, going to God knows where. She tried asking the driver, but he just apologized, saying he wasn't supposed to talk to her. She groaned at Nelson's stupid orders and cursed him in her mind. Finally, the car came to a stop, and she looked outside only to find herself in front of a hospital. What the why was this man too desperate and impatient to get a baby? She shook her head, knowing she was here for the IVF treatment, and walked inside the hospital. Nelson was already present inside, and as soon as his eyes fell on her, he walked towards her. "Let's go," he said plainly, and turned to leave, but she held his hand. "Why did you give me this phone?" she asked angrily, showing the phone, and he glanced at the phone and then at her. "This is not for your personal use. I have given it to you so that only I can contact you through it. And it's only temporary. Take it before you leave." The coldness in his voice was enough indication that he never did anything out of feelings. It was pure business for him, and nothing else. As they walked towards their destination, she looked at him curiously, but his face was as usual blank, devoid of any emotion. "How did you agree so easily for this option?" She asked the question, which had been bugging her the most. He could have threatened her or blackmailed her, or forced himself on her. But he didn't. Why? "I sure am a monster and a devil, but I don't force myself on anyone. I can't do that." He looked at her as he uttered the last word, and she couldn't look away. He confused her with his words. Soon they reached the doctor's cabin and entered inside. The doctor smiled and welcomed them, and Melissa reciprocated, and as expected, Nelson stayed unaffected. "Have a seat, Mr. and Mrs.?" He trailed off, and Melissa shifted uncomfortably. Nelson straightaway sat on the chair, and Melissa looked at him stunned. "Doctor, we are here for the IVF treatment," he said without beating around the bush, and Melissa palmed her face mentally. "Okay, I believe you aren't able to conceive by sexual intercourse." The doctor nodded to himself, and Nelson looked at Melissa, who just looked away. "She is a virgin," Nelson stated bluntly, and Melissa's eyes widened, whereas the doctor looked stunned. "Oh well, okay," the doctor said, confused, but didn't question further. Melissa glared at Nelson for being this insensitive, but he cared less. "Okay, so IVF is a process whereby we'll collect your eggs and his sperm and combine them in our lab until they form an embryo or embryos. After that, we'll place the embryos in her uterus, and after 2 or 3 weeks she'll have to take a pregnancy test. Now this procedure, what I have explained, was in short so that you understand what it is, and also the chances to get pregnant from this treatment depend on your age as well as where you get this done. And I can assure you that we'll provide you with the best service." He smiled, and Melissa looked at Nelson. "How much time does this treatment take? And are you sure she can take this treatment, considering she is a virgin?" he asked without looking at her. "That's no problem. We have had cases of such type as well. Also, this process might take a little time," he informed, and Nelson nodded while Melissa looked nervous. "Do you want to ask something, Mrs.?" The doctor turned to her and asked, sensing her nervousness. "There is a specific time where females produce eggs, right?" she asked, ignoring Nelson, and looked straight at the doctor. "Yes, you are right. And if you are not in that period of producing eggs, then we'll inject you the hormones, after which you'll start producing eggs, and only after they are fully developed, we will retrieve them to combine with his sperm." He answered, and she nodded, lost in her thoughts. "You don't need to worry, we'll take care of everything," he assured, and Melissa smiled nervously. After they were done with the questions, Melissa waited outside and Nelson paid for the treatment. So this was it. She was going to get pregnant through this treatment, and her life will change entirely after it. She just hoped the results would come positive at the end. Billionaire's Contract episode. 7. Melissa's point of view. Within 2 days, Melissa was injected with the medication, after which her eggs were retrieved and Nelson's sperm was taken to the lab. They were asked to wait for minimum 5 days until the embryos were formed. 5 days later, they were called and the embryos were planted inside Melissa's uterus, after which she was asked to rest. Because the chances of getting pregnant are minimum, they would plant 2, 3 embryos, and Melissa was informed about the same. After everything was done, Melissa and Nelson were asked to wait for 2 weeks, and then the pregnancy test would be done by them. Amidst all this, Nelson appeared to be least bothered, and it was somewhere weird for her, because it was him who wanted a child, not her. But she chucked it off because when did he seem interested? Nelson left for his work after that, and Melissa informed him that she'll be visiting her Hope once she got there. As she had expected, all the kids screamed in excitement at her return. She hugged them all and had a nice chat with them, while Sarah just stared at them with a smile. This orphanage was solely Melissa's responsibility, but now that she had to be at Willingston Mansion, Sarah had promised her that she will be taking care of them until she returns. "Sarah," Melissa called as she walked towards her, smiling. They hugged each other before Sarah took her in a room to know about the progress. "What is happening?" Sarah asked, looking at her face, which didn't show any kind of distress. She just looked kinda nervous. "We are going for the IVF treatment," she announced nervously, and Sarah's eyes widened. "So you aren't going to—" Sarah left the sentence incomplete and waited for her to complete it, but Melissa just nodded a no. Sarah grinned widely and jumped upon her, startling her. "That's such a wonderful news. But how did he agree? Because as far as I know, he's never taken a step back for anyone," she asked with a confused face, while Melissa frowned as well. "You know him?" Melissa asked back, and Sarah rolled her eyes at her innocent question. She surely was unaware of the world. "Melissa? He's the Nelson Willingston, the billionaire, the owner of Willingston Company, and the favorite gossip material for the media." Sarah sighed and Melissa had her mouth hung open. Was he that famous? "Why didn't you tell me before? What if the media comes to know about this contract? What about me? This orphanage? Everything will be exposed." She panicked, and Sarah gave her a helpless look. "This is why I was angry in the first place. You are too naive for this world, and talk to him about this, okay?" Melissa just nodded, with a worried look on her face. Nelson was sitting on his chair, relaxed, and a smirk lingered on his lips as he recalled his conversation with the doctor before they were going to plant the embryos into her uterus. He walked inside the doctor's cabin like he owned it and sat on the chair. "Do you need something, Mr. Willingston? The embryos are ready, and it'll be quick." The doctor informed, but he was least interested. Now, you tell me honestly, what are the chances that she will get pregnant through this treatment? Can you write it on a stamp paper? He raised his eyebrow while the doctor fumbled. We can't do that, sir, because we cannot guarantee that she will get pregnant, he said truthfully, and Nelson stared at him coldly. First things first, if she does get pregnant, that's good for both of us. But if she doesn't, he trailed off looking at the doctor, who now was nervous. I will make sure that your career and this hospital ends. And this is my guarantee, he said in a low voice while his cold eyes stayed on the doctor, who started sweating. Sir, please, you can't do this. What do you want then? The doctor pleaded to the devil, who just sat with a smirk. Either you give me a 100% guarantee that this treatment will be successful, or don't plant the whatever you were going to in her. He gave him the choice, and the doctor looked at him shocked. He didn't want them to place the embryos in her uterus. Then why did he pay us? But then how? Okay, we won't plant the embryos. He changed his statement, looking at his face, which held a warning. What followed was the doctors pretending to plant the embryos in her and asking her to rest. She was also informed that they'll do the pregnancy test after 2 weeks, just as per the procedure. Now 2 weeks he could wait, right? Of course. Had they given him the guarantee that she will get pregnant? Then he wouldn't have done this, but he could not just invest his money into something and get no result out of it. He wasn't a businessman to incur losses. He agreed for what she demanded. And now, after 2 weeks, when the results will be positive, she will have to agree for what he will demand. Because that's how you play. After Melissa got back to the mansion, she couldn't concentrate on anything. She had to talk to Nelson, and even though the doctor had asked her not to take stress, she couldn't help it. She tried to read books, or tried to understand the features of the new phone, but nothing worked. She wanted answers, and only he could give her them. At 10:30, when he came, she reminded herself to not jump on him the first instant and demand answers. She would wait until he freshened up and had his dinner. When after 15 minutes she could no longer keep her patience, she marched out of her room and landed in front of his. She knocked once, twice, thrice, but got no answer. Frustrated, she pushed the door open and entered inside to find the room empty. She frowned and looked around, but he was nowhere. Just then she heard a click, and Nelson walked out of the bathroom wearing only his trousers. She gasped loudly, looking at his naked chest, which was still dripping with water. She had no idea for how long she stood there gawking at his chest and his abs. Nelson smirked, seeing her gaping at him shamelessly, and he could clearly see his effect on her. You need something? Finally, he asked, when she didn't come out of her trance. Melissa turned around, embarrassed as hell. She thought of running out that instant, but controlled herself and, composing herself, faced him. I want to ask you something. She tried hard not to look at his upper body, and looking at his smirk, she wanted to just smack him. He just gestured her to go ahead. You are a billionaire? She asked dumbly, and he raised his eyebrows as if amused. So? She found his response rude, but ignoring it, she continued. So, what if the media comes to know about it? About me and the contract between us. I don't want to be in the limelight, Mr. Willingston. She said sternly, and he continued staring at her. Suddenly, he stepped ahead in her direction, making her heart drum against her chest. She couldn't move an inch from her place, even if she wanted to run. He came dangerously close to her, such that she could feel the heat radiating off of his upper body. She shivered involuntarily and looked up at him. "I have already taken care of that. This news won't be going out," he whispered, and she should have felt the relief. Instead, she could feel her body heating up. She gulped, looking into his eyes, which felt like digging into her soul. She had to run, because she couldn't afford to get trapped into this devil's plan.